Alright guys, in this video we're going to take a step-by-step look at the AICPA blueprints for the auditing and attestation section of the CPA exam. By the end of this video, you should have a clear understanding of the sections that you know well and the ones that you need to review before taking the audit exam. You can also use this blueprint as a checklist while you're doing your studying to make sure that you cover all the relevant areas of the exam. Let's get into it. If you're interested in learning more about accounting, taxes, or becoming a CPA, make sure to visit us at breezycpa.com to check out our library of courses. So the CPA exam requires all candidates to pass 3 core exam sections and 1 discipline exam section of the candidate's choosing. The uniform CPA exam is designed according to the AICPA exam blueprints, which we're looking at now. Core exam section assesses the knowledge and the skills that all newly licensed CPAs need in their role to protect public interest. The discipline exam sections assess the knowledge and the skills in the representative discipline domain applicable to the CPA in their role to protect the public interest. The 3 core exam sections are each 4 hours long. This includes AUD, FAR, and Reg, and the 3 discipline exam sections are also each 4 hours long, and they include BAR, ISC, and TCP. So taking a look at the table down here, we can see how each section of the exam is broken down. So we have section time, we have multiple choice questions, and we have task-based simulations. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at AUD, but let's take a look at all of these different sections so you get an understanding of how they're broken down. We can see here that all of the exams are 4 hours long. Now for AUD, we have multiple choice questions, 78 of them. So you can see that this varies between the different types of exams. Here for FAR, we have 50 questions. For Reg, we have 72. For BAR, 50. For ISC, 82. And for TCP, 68. And for the task-based simulations, for AUD, we're going to have 7. For FAR, you're going to have 7. For Reg, you're going to have 8. So on and so forth, 7, 6, and 7 for TCP. So how is the weight distributed between the multiple choice questions and the task-based simulations? Well, for the most part, all the exams have a 50-50 distribution. So the weight of the multiple choice questions is going to be 50% of your exam score, and the weight of the task-based simulations is going to be the other 50% of your exam score. The only exception is ISC, where the multiple choice questions are 60% of your exam score and the task-based simulations are 40% of your exam score. All the exam sections are broken down into 5 different testlets. The first 2 testlets are multiple choice questions, and these are broken down by half and half. So for AUD, for example, we have 78 multiple choice questions. 39 are going to be in the first testlet. 39 are going to be in the second testlet. And then the next 3 testlets are your task-based simulations. So you're going to have 3 testlets that are the remaining questions related to the task-based simulations for that section. So getting into what you'll need to know for the auditing and attestation section of the uniform CPA exam. This section is going to test your knowledge and skills of what a CPA candidate must demonstrate when performing the following types of engagements. So audit engagements, including financial statement audits, compliance audits, and audits of internal control integrated with the audit of financial statements, audits of entities that are receiving federal awards or grants, and these are going to be based on the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, audits that include issuer entities subject to requirements that are set forth by the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, audits for non-issuers that are subject to the requirements that are set forth by the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, auditing standards board or government entities subject to the requirements of the U.S. Government Accountability Office. Attestation engagements, which are subject to the requirements set forth by the AICPA Auditing Standards Board, and accounting and review service engagements, which are set forth by the AICPA Accounting and Review Services Committee. The auditing and attestation exam will assess a candidate's abilities when it comes to roles such as planning, risk assessment, performing procedures, obtaining evidence, and reporting for various types of engagements. This assessment of a candidate's skills will incorporate data and technology concepts, professional skepticism and professional judgment, applied research with a focus on reviewing and using excerpts of source materials in order to complete a range of tasks that include identifying issues, analyzing facts, and determining appropriate responses. So the way in which the AICPA Blueprint organizes each section of the CPA exam is by content area, by content group, and by content topic. So taking a look at these areas, So for the auditing and attestation section of the exam, we have 4 different content areas. So area 1 is going to be ethics, professional responsibilities, and general principles. And this is going to be 15 to 25% of the exam. For area 2, we have assessing risk and developing a planned response. And this is going to be 25 to 35% of the exam. For area 3, we have performing further procedures and obtaining evidence. This is going to be 30 to 40% of the exam. And for area 4, we have forming conclusions and reporting, and this is going to be 10 to 20% of the exam. So taking a look at each of these areas in more detail, for area 1, it's going to include the following: ethics and independence, professional skepticism, nature, scope, and the terms of engagements, the requirements for engagement documentation, and understanding of audit and assurance quality. For area 2 of the exam, this is going to focus on engagement strategy and engagement planning, internal and external factors related to understanding an entity, and understanding an entity's control environment and business processes, including an understanding of the Committee of Sponsored Organizations Internal Control Integrated Framework. Area 2 also includes an understanding of SOC 1 reports, materiality, including the performance materiality and tolerable misstatements, assessing and responding to risks of material misstatements, whether due to fraud or error, planning for and using the work of others, and specific areas of engagement risk, including compliance with laws and regulations. For Area 3 of the exam, this includes the use of data and information, obtaining sufficient appropriate audit evidence, sampling techniques, performing procedures to obtain evidence, including tests of controls and tests of details, specific matters that require special audit consideration, and misstatements and internal control deficiencies, including preparing a summary of misstatements and determining their effects. Moving on to Area 4 of the exam, this area covers engagement reporting, so this is going to include reporting on auditing and attestation engagements, considerations for performing preparation engagements, considerations for reporting on compilation and review engagements, considerations for reporting on compliance aspects as part of an audit engagement, and other reporting considerations when performing engagements. As we discussed earlier, the audit exam is comprised of both multiple choice questions and task-based simulations. And there's an important note here from the AICPA in regards to how the questions are phrased. So questions may refer to audit engagements, including phrases such as an audit of a non-issuer or an audit of an issuer. These are very important distinctions here that you need to know before you go in to take your exams. Make sure that when you're reading the question, understand what the question is asking, and these phrases are very important. Are we looking at a non-issuer or are we looking at an issuer? Questions will refer to other types of engagements by including phrases such as the examination of pro forma financial information, review engagements, interim review, compilation engagements, and also the use of terms such as auditor, accountant, and practitioner. These various terms can change the question depending on which of these terms is used within that question. So make sure you understand the differentiation between each of these types of terms before going into your exam. Each section of the CPA exam is based on a skill framework known as Bloom's taxonomy, and this relates to the various skill levels that you'll need to have in order to respond to these questions. So they vary from remembering and understanding to the application of various knowledge and concepts to the analysis of that information and the evaluation of that information. So various questions are going to have various levels of skills that you're going to need to have in order to respond to those questions, going from remembering and understanding all the way up to evaluation. So a quick summary of what we just went over. Remember, we had the content areas and the skill allocation for all the areas. So for area 1, we have ethics, professional responsibilities, and general principles, 15 to 20% of the exam. For content area 2, we have assessing risk and developing planned responses, 25 to 35%. Content area 3, performing further procedures and obtaining evidence, 30 to 40%. And content area 4, for forming conclusions and reporting, which is 10 to 20% of the exam. exam. Now, as far as the skill allocation for these various areas, we have evaluation, analysis, application, remembering, and understanding. So for evaluation, you can see here that we have a 5 to 15% of the exam is going to be evaluating the responses. Analysis is going to be 15 to 25%. Application is going to be 30 to 40%. And remembering and understanding is going to be 30 to 40% for the auditing and attestation exam. If you're interested in getting your own copy of the AICPA Blueprint that we're looking at here, you're welcome to visit us at breezycpa.com, and we have a free downloadable version of the AICPA Blueprints on our website. You can also visit the AICPA website, and they have a downloadable version for you there as well. One of the things that many CPA candidates don't realize is that whatever CPA review course you choose to utilize to study for the CPA exam, they all follow the AICPA Blueprint. The AICPA Blueprint is the standard for what is going to be on the exam. So every CPA review program follows the same AICPA Blueprint. Now, whether you choose to use Breezy CPA or a different CPA review course, that's up to you. Of course, we would appreciate it if you choose Breezy CPA, and if you do, please use Breezy20 to get 20% off your order at checkout. And you can see here that for the auditing and attestation section of the exam, we offer a comprehensive course that includes a study guide, a cram course, and videos lessons for each section of the AICPA Blueprint. So we can see here that for Area 1, we have the AICPA Code of Professional Conduct. Here we have a video lesson for that, the AICPA Code of Professional Conduct, requirements of the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, requirements of the SEC and the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, requirements for Government Accountability Office and Department of Labor, requirements for the Government Accountability Office and Department of Labor. And each of these sections includes simulations and 5,000 test bank questions for you to go through. So this is a comprehensive course that goes through each section of the AICPA Blueprint to make sure that you are ready for your exams when exam day comes. So whatever CPA review course you choose to use, we hope that you pass your exams. We of course encourage you to use Breezy CPA, but basically all of the CPA review courses follow the same AICPA blueprints. And that's important for you to understand that it's just a matter of which course you prefer, which one helps you understand and retain that information best for your exams. So getting into the detailed breakdown of the auditing and attestation exam, starting with Area 1, we have ethics, professional responsibilities, and general principles, which makes up 15 to 25% of the exam. And as we discussed, these areas are broken up by content group, by skill, and representative tasks. And within these areas of skill, remember we have remembering and understanding, application, analysis, and evaluation. So starting here with ethics, independence, and professional responsibilities, we have the AICPA Code of Professional Conduct. And for this area, you're going to need to understand the principles, rules, and interpretations included in the AICPA Code of Professional Conduct. You're going to need to be able to apply those principal rules and interpretations. You're going to need to be able to apply the conceptual framework for members in public practice and members in business. You're going to need to be able to apply the conceptual framework for independence included in the AICPA Code of Professional Conduct to situations that present them threats to compliance with the rules included in the Code of Professional Conduct. And we can see here that for these representative tasks, for the first one, this is a remembering and understanding task, whereas for the other ones, these are going to be applications. So you're going to need to know how to apply these representative tasks. Moving on, we have the requirements of the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. Here you're going to need to be able to understand the ethical and independence requirements of the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, and you're going to need to be able to apply the ethical requirements and independence rules of the SEC and the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board to various situations. And again, here for this first task, this is going to be remembering and understanding, and for the second one, you're going to need to be able to apply these various requirements here for this area. Next, we have the requirements of the Government Accountability Office and the Department of Labor. Here, you're going to need to be able to understand the ethical and independence requirements of the Government Accountability Office, government auditing standards, and you're also going to need to be able to understand the independence requirements of the Department of Labor. So for these two tasks, these are going to be remembering and understanding the requirements for these two tasks. Continuing on with the requirements of the Government Accountability Office and the Department of Labor, you're going to need to be able to apply the ethical requirements and independent rules of the Government Accountability Office and the government auditing standards to various situations. You're also going to need to be able to apply the independence rules of the Department of Labor to various situations. Moving on to professional skepticism and professional judgment, you'll need to be able to understand the concepts of professional skepticism and professional judgment and understand auditor biases when acting with professional skepticism, including threats, incentives, and judgment-making shortcuts for the auditor. Next, we have nature and scope, and this is going to be related to audit engagements, where you need to identify the nature, scope, and objectives of the different types of audit engagements for both issuers and non-issuers. Next, we have engagements conducted under the Government Accountability Office and government auditing standards, where you'll need to be able to identify the nature, scope, and objectives of various engagements performed in accordance with the Government Accountability Office and government auditing standards. Next, we have other engagements where you'll need to identify the nature, scope, and objective of attestation engagements and accounting and review service engagements. Continuing on, we have terms of engagement. Here we'll need to look at the preconditions for an engagement, where you'll need to identify the preconditions needed to accept or continue an engagement. Next, we have the terms of engagement and the engagement letter. Here, you'll need to identify the factors affecting the acceptance or the continuance of an engagement, including the communication with the predecessor auditors. You'll need to be able to recall when it is acceptable to agree to management's request for a change in a type of engagement, for instance, from an audit to a review. Next, you'll need to understand how to perform procedures to confirm that a common understanding of the terms of an engagement exists with management and those charged with governance. And you'll also need to be able to document the terms of an engagement in a written engagement letter or other suitable form of written agreement. Continuing on, we have the requirements for engagement documentation, where you will need to be able to identify the elements that comprise sufficient appropriate documentation in both physical and electronic form for an engagement. You'll need to be able to identify the requirements for the assembly and the retention of documentation in both physical and electronic form for an engagement, and you'll need to be able to prepare documentation that is sufficient to enable an experienced auditor or practitioner who has no previous connection with an engagement to understand the nature, timing, and extent and results of the procedures that were performed for an engagement. Next, we have communication with management and those charged with governance. So first, we have plan, scope, and timing of an engagement, where you'll need to identify the matters related to the plan, scope, and timing of an engagement. You'll need to be able to prepare presentation materials and supporting schedules for the use in communicating the plan, scope, and timing of an engagement. And next, we have internal control related matters, where you'll need to identify the matters related to deficiencies and material weaknesses in the internal controls of a company. And you also need to be able to prepare written communication materials for the use in communicating identified internal control deficiencies and material weaknesses for an engagement. Next, we have audit and assurance quality, where you'll need to be able to identify a CPA firm's responsibilities for its accounting and auditing practices and its engagement quality. And you'll also need to be able to explain the procedures and responsibilities for managing engagement quality. Moving on to Area 2 of the Auditing and Attestation exam, we have assessing the risk and developing a planned response, which is 25 to 35% of the weight on the exam. Here we are going to be looking at planning an engagement. First, we have the overall engagement strategy, where you'll need to be able to explain the purpose and the significance of the overall engagement strategy for an engagement. Next, we have the engagement plan, where you'll need to be able to prepare a draft engagement plan for specific processes, accounts, or classes of transactions. And you'll need to be able to prepare supporting plan-related materials for a detailed engagement plan, starting with a prior year engagement plan or with a template. Moving on to Part B of Area 2, you'll need to be able to understand an entity and its environment, including its external factors. You need to be able to understand supply and demand, as well as elasticity measures and profit maximization. You'll need to be able to understand business cycles. You'll need to be able to identify relevant factors, and you'll need to also understand internal factors, where you'll need to understand an entity's responsibilities with respect to corporate governance provisions of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, as well as to identify the relevant factors that define the nature of the entity, including the impact on its risk of material misstatement. Continuing on with Area 2, we have an understanding of the entity's control environment and its business processes, including information technology systems. For Part 1 here, you have the Committee of Sponsored Organizations Internal Control Integrated Framework, where you'll need to be able to define the internal control within the context of the Committee of Sponsored Organizations Internal Control Framework. You'll need to be able to identify and define the components, principles, and underlying structure of the Committee of Sponsored Organizations Internal Control Framework. Next, you have the control environment, IT general controls, and entity-level controls, where you'll need to be able to understand the elements of an entity's control environment, including the design and implementation of general IT controls, and you'll need to be able to perform procedures to obtain an understanding of how an entity has responded to risks arising from the use of IT. Next, you have business processes and the design of internal controls, including the IT environment, where you'll need to be able to identify and document significant business processes and data flows that directly or indirectly impact the entity's financial statements. You'll need to be able to perform a walkthrough of significant business processes. You'll need to be able to obtain an understanding of an entity's IT infrastructure. You'll need to be able to obtain an understanding of the IT applications that directly or indirectly the source of the financial transactions and the data used to record financial transactions. And you'll need to be able to perform tests of the design and implementation of relevant automated and manual transaction level internal controls. Continuing with business processes and the IT environment, you'll need to be able to identify and document relevant automated and manual controls. You'll need to be able to conclude whether the relevant automated and manual transaction level internal controls are effectively designed and placed into operation. Moving on, we have implications of an entity using a service organization, where you'll need to understand the difference between a SOC 1 and a SOC 2 engagement. You'll need to be able to identify and document the purpose and significance of an entity's use of service organizations. You'll need to be able to use a SOC 1 Type 2 report to determine the nature and the extent of testing procedures to be performed. Moving on, we have the limitations of controls and risk of management override, where you'll need to understand the limitations of the internal controls and potential impact on the risk of material misstatement. And you'll need to be able to identify and document the risks associated with management override of internal controls. Next, we have materiality for the financial statements as a whole, where you'll need to understand the materiality, including the qualitative considerations as it relates to the financial statements and the related disclosures as a whole. You'll need to be able to calculate materiality for an entity's financial statements as a whole, and you'll need to be able to calculate the materiality levels to be applied to the classes of transactions, account balances, and disclosures in an audit of an issuer and a non-issuer. Continuing with materiality, we have tolerable misstatements and performance materiality, where you'll need to be able to understand the use of tolerable misstatements or the performance materiality in an audit, and you'll need to be able to determine the tolerable misstatement or the performance materiality for the purpose of assessing the risk of material misstatement. Continuing on, we have assessing and responding to the risk of material misstatement, whether due to fraud or error, where you'll need to be able to determine pressures, incentives, and opportunities for fraud. You'll need to be able to determine the risk of material misstatement, whether due to fraud or error. You'll need to be able to determine the responses to the risks of material misstatement at the financial statement level. You'll need to be able to determine the appropriate procedures to assess the operating effectiveness of relevant controls. You'll need to be able to determine appropriate substantive procedures to test relevant assertions for each significant class of transactions. And you'll need to be able to determine procedures to satisfy the requirements and objectives for an attestation engagement. And you'll need to be able to determine the procedures to satisfy the requirements and objectives of an accounting and review service engagement. Continuing with assessing and responding to risk of material misstatement due to fraud or error, you'll need to be able to assess the risk of material misstatement due to fraud or error at the financial statement level. You'll need to be able to assess the potential impact of identified risks of material misstatement at the relevant assertion level. You'll need to be able to analyze the risk of material misstatement, including the potential impact of individual and cumulative misstatements. And you'll need to be able to use outputs from audit data and analytical procedures. Next, we have planning for and using the work of others, where you'll need to be able to identify the factors to consider in determining the extent to which an engagement team can use the work of the internal audit function and IT auditors and auditor specialists. You'll also need to be able to determine the nature and the scope of the work of the internal audit function. You also need to be able to perform and document procedures to determine the extent to which an engagement team can use the work of the internal audit function. Next, we have specific areas of engagement risk, and here we'll need to look at an entity's compliance with laws and regulations, where you'll need to understand the accountant's responsibilities with respect to various laws and regulations. You'll need to understand the accountant's responsibilities with respect to laws and regulations that are fundamental to the entity's business. You'll need to perform tests of compliance with laws and regulations that have a direct effect on the material amounts or disclosures in an entity's financial statements, and you'll need to be able to perform a test of compliance with laws and regulations. Continuing on, we have accounting estimates, where you'll need to be able to recognize the potential impact of lower complexity and higher complexity significant accounting estimates on the risk of material misstatement. Next, we have related parties and related party transactions, where you'll need to perform procedures in order to identify related party transactions and relationships. And here we have uniform guidance for single audits, where you'll need to understand when an entity is required to have a single audit in accordance with the audit requirements of the uniform guidance. Next, we have Area 3 of the audit exam, which is performing further procedures and obtaining evidence, which is 30 to 40% of the auditing and attestation exam. Here we're going to take a look at the use of data and information. We're going to request and prepare and transform data. So you're going to need to be able to explain the components of the relational database. You're going to need to be able to explain the characteristics and uses of different measurement scales, and to determine the attribute structures, format, and sources of data needed when making a data extraction request, and to determine the methods to transform data to complete a planned audit procedure. Next, we need to understand the reliability of data and information, so we need to be able to perform procedures in order to validate the reliability of our data and information. Next, we have data analytics, where you'll need to be able to describe how to apply automated tools and techniques to process, organize, and structure and present data. And you'll need to be able to perform procedures using outputs from the audit data and analytical techniques to determine relationships. Continuing on with Area 3, we need to understand the concept of sufficient appropriate evidence, where we'll need to be able to determine the sources of sufficient appropriate evidence. We'll need to exercise professional skepticism and professional judgment while analyzing information. And we'll need to be able to conclude whether sufficient appropriate audit evidence has been obtained to achieve the objectives of the planned procedures. Next, you'll need to understand sampling techniques, where you'll need to understand the purpose and application of various sampling techniques. You'll also need to be able to identify the appropriate population of items to sample to meet the objectives of planned procedures. You'll need to be able to determine the appropriate sampling method to be used in order to accomplish the objectives of the planned procedures. And you'll need to be able to use sampling techniques to extrapolate the characteristics of a population from a sample of items. Continuing on with Area 3, we have procedures to obtain sufficient appropriate evidence. Here we have tests of controls and tests of details, where you'll need to use observation and inspection to obtain evidence. You'll need to use recalculation to test the mathematical accuracy of information to obtain evidence. You'll need to use reperformance to independently execute procedures of controls to obtain evidence. You'll need to inquire of management and others to gather evidence and document the results. You'll need to be able to analyze the responses obtained during these structured interviews or informal conversations with management and others. And you'll need to be able to perform tests of operating effectiveness of internal controls. And you'll need to be able to perform tests of details, including the analysis of exceptions to identify potential misstatements in the audit of financial statements. Next, we have analytical procedures, where you'll need to be able to determine the suitability of substantive analytical procedures to provide evidence to support an identified assertion. You'll also need to be able to perform substantive analytical procedures. You'll need to be able to perform analytical procedures near the end of an audit engagement that assist the auditor when forming an overall conclusion. And you'll need to be able to evaluate and investigate the differences resulting from analytical procedures. Continuing on with Area 3, we have external confirmations, where you'll need to be able to confirm significant account balances and transactions using appropriate tools and techniques. You'll also need to be able to analyze external confirmation responses to determine the need for follow-up or further investigation. Next, we have specific matters that require special consideration. So we have accounting estimates, where you'll need to be able to recalculate and reperform procedures to validate the inputs and assumptions of an entity's significant accounting estimates. You'll need to be able to perform procedures in order to validate an entity's calculations. You'll need to be able to conclude on the reasonableness of significant accounting estimates with the lower risk of material misstatement or complexity in an audit. Next, we have investment in securities, where you'll need to be able to identify the considerations relating to the measurement and disclosure of the fair value of investments in securities in an audit. You'll also need to be able to test management's assumptions regarding the conclusions and adjustments related to the valuation of investments in securities in an audit. Next, we have inventory and inventory held by others, where you'll need to be able to test the ending inventory quantities in an audit by obtaining evidence regarding the existence and the condition of the inventory. And lastly, here we have litigation claims and assessments, where you'll need to be able to perform the appropriate audit procedures, including inquiry of management and others, reviewing minutes, and sending external confirmations to detect the existence of litigation claims and assessments. Next, we have an entity's ability to continue as a going concern. Here, you'll need to identify factors that should be considered when performing planned procedures that may indicate substantial doubt about an entity's ability to continue as a going concern. Next, we have uniform guidance for single audits, where you'll need to be able to test transactions related to federal awards for compliance with statutes and regulations. Moving on to misstatements and internal control deficiencies, where you'll need to be able to prepare a summary of corrected and uncorrected misstatements. You'll need to be able to determine the effect of uncorrected misstatements on an entity's financial statements. You'll need to be able to determine the effect of identified misstatements on the assessment of internal control over financial reporting. And you'll need to be able to evaluate internal control deficiencies to determine the potential impact of the nature, timing, and extent of audit procedures. Next, we have written representations, where you'll need to be able to identify the written representations that should be obtained from management or those charged with governance in engagement. Next, we have subsequent events and subsequent discovered facts, where you'll need to recall the impact of subsequently discovered facts on the auditor's report. You'll need to be able to perform procedures to identify subsequent events that should reflect an entity's current period financial statements and disclosures. And you'll need to be able to determine whether the identified subsequent events are appropriately reflected in the entity's financial statements and disclosures. Continuing on to Area 4 of the Auditing and Attestation exam, we are looking at forming conclusions and reporting, which is 10 to 20% of the Auditing and Attestation exam. Here we're going to take a look at reporting on audit engagements, where you're going to need to be able to identify the factors that an auditor should consider when forming an opinion on the entity's financial statements. You're going to need to be able to identify the factors that an auditor should consider when forming an opinion on the effectiveness of internal control in an audit. You're going to need to be able to identify the type of opinion, whether unqualified, unmodified, qualified, adverse, or a disclaimer of opinion that an auditor should render on an audit. You're going to need to be able to identify the appropriate use of emphasis of matter and other matter paragraphs. You're going to need to be able to determine the appropriate form and content of an auditor's report for an engagement. And you're going to need to be able to determine the appropriate form and content of a report on the audit of an internal control over financial reporting. Next, we have reporting on attestation engagements, where we're going to be looking at examination or review engagements, where you're going to need to be able to identify the factors that a practitioner should consider when issuing an assertion-based examination, direct examination, or a review report. And you're going to need to be able to determine the appropriate form and content of the audit accountant's report for an assertion-based examination, direct examination, or review of an attestation engagement. Continuing on with Area 4, we have agreed upon procedure engagements, where you'll need to be able to identify the factors that a practitioner should consider when issuing an agreed upon procedures report for an attestation engagement. You'll need to be able to determine the appropriate form and content of an agreed upon procedure report for an attestation engagement. Moving on, we have accounting and review service engagements. Firstly, we have preparation engagements, where you'll need to be able to identify the factors that an accountant should consider when performing a preparation engagement. We have compilation engagements, where you'll need to be able to identify the factors that an accountant should consider when reporting on an engagement to compile an entity's financial statements. And you'll need to be able to determine the appropriate form and content of an accountant's report for a compilation engagement. Next, we have review engagements, where you'll need to be able to identify the factors that an accountant should consider when reporting on an engagement to review an entity's financial statements. And you'll need to be able to determine the appropriate form and content of the accountant's report for a review engagement. Next, we have reporting on compliance, where you'll need to be able to identify the factors that an auditor should consider when reporting on compliance with aspects of contractual agreements or regulatory requirements. And you'll need to be able to identify factors that a practitioner should consider when reporting on an attestation engagement related to an entity's compliance with requirements to specific laws, regulations, and rules. Next, we have other reporting considerations, and we're going to be taking a look at comparative statements and consistency between periods. So here you need to be able to identify the factors that would affect the comparability or consistency of the financial statements. We also have other information in documents with audited statements, where you'll need to understand the auditor's responsibility related to other information included in documents with audited financial statements. Next, we have review of interim financial information, where you'll need to be able to identify the factors an auditor should consider when reporting on an engagement to review interim financial information. Next, we have supplementary information, where you'll need to identify the factors an auditor should consider when reporting on supplementary information. Next, we have additional reporting requirements under the Government Accountability Office and Government Auditing Standards, where you'll need to identify requirements under the Government Accountability Office and Government Auditing Standards. And you'll need to be able to understand the requirements when preparing the auditor's report on compliance and internal control over compliance. And lastly, we have special purpose frameworks, where you'll need to identify the factors an auditor should consider when reporting on the audit of financial statements prepared in accordance with the cash basis, tax basis, regulatory basis, contractual basis, or other basis of accounting. And that includes our full walkthrough of the AICPA blueprints for the auditing and attestation section of the CPA examination. I wish you all the best of luck in studying for your exams, and I hope you choose Breezy CPA as your study review course. Remember that we have comprehensive videos, questions, and task-based simulations for all the sections that we just went over in the AICPA blueprint. I hope to see you guys soon. If you found this video helpful, please make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more content. If you're interested in learning more about accounting, taxes, or becoming a CPA, visit us at breezycpa.com for courses. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.